Hello and welcome back to the Progress Report. I'm your host, Tom Rourke, and today we're exploring the increasingly high-stakes intersection of governance and innovation, where the rapid rise of AI is forcing organizations to rethink how they operate. AI is no longer just a tool, it's becoming a decision maker, a collaborator, a colleague, a driver of change at scale and moving from isolated pilots to the very core of business operations. So what happens when governance is no longer just about limiting risk, but about enabling trust and experimentation, but also realizing value at scale? I'm delighted to be joined today by two world-leading experts in the field, Dr. Ashwin Mehta, who's the CEO and founder of Mehtadology, and my own friend and colleague, Dr. Diana Wolfe, who heads AI research and strategy here at Kyndryl. Ash, Diana, you're both very welcome to the Progress Report.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
So before we begin, I want to just try to get some personal context here. We were interviewing somebody recently who described this moment, this is a very experienced technology, described this moment as the most exciting time to be in technology of their careers. And I'm just curious to throw the same question to both of you. I mean, how would you describe this moment in terms of your context and experience? Maybe Ash, if I start with you.
Yeah, I mean, it's very, very exciting. And these are the times to be alive, right? You don't really want to be alive during those boring, 20, 30, 50 years when nothing really happens. Everything's happening now. And it's very exciting. Things are changing. We don't really know how it's going to pan out, but that's part of the charm, right?
Diana, sentiment you'd echo?
I don't know that I echo all of the excitement all of the time. My background in a long time ago, my degree was in art history. And so I am aware of the eras of history where nothing happens. But it does feel like we're in that energizing era of history where we're building and we're designing and we're doing things that we won't even fully understand until later, right? And hopefully we're setting the intentions when we build them. So the balance of that is exciting, but also exhausting.
What's your view on that role that we have in terms of establishing governance in the context of all of this excitement?
So we really need to be clear about what is it that we're talking about. And governance in the AI space 10 years ago versus governance in the AI space 3 years ago, they're different things. And governance in the machine learning space used to be very different to governance in the generative AI space, the chatbot space, especially when what we're talking about is most companies were really buying software as a service that had some AI capability to it. The governance, frankly, wasn't that different from any other software as a service, except there were a couple of additional bits that people were doing around AI. Lots of talk about ethics, but poorly understood. People would talk about bias, transparency, explainability, which is not the same as ethics. And then now we have the orchestration and agentic revolution, which have a very different slant on governance. So it depends on what we're talking about. But in each of these spaces, we could be covering a lot of things. The tendency in big companies, it tends towards the checkbox. So we're doing something because somebody else said we have to. We have to do this because there's a process. I'm never a fan of that kind of thing because I'm sure we'll come on to this, but it's a devolving thought process. When you're thinking about risk, you should be thinking about it. You should be making an evaluation and a judgment and not just ticking a box. And we move towards this agentic revolution, and we need to let go of these checkboxes because we need to be able to think through what the implications are of a synthetic workforce that is going to take actions and take them much more quickly than a human workforce could. Potential for great opportunity, potential for great outcomes, but also potential for mistakes that happen very, very quickly in a runaway fashion that we can't really control. So thinking through the approach to governance, I think, is very critical, particularly with the agentic side, less so with the AI SaaS side, because that kind of governance is a little bit more established.
I guess, Diana, when you talk, Ash mentioned the thinking through this, and as I was listening to him, I was reminded of, when you got debates about different forms of governance around, say, financial services, you have these discussions around rules-based versus principles-based governance, and the implication in the principles-based one, there's a lot more responsibility on people to think things through rather than comply with a set of rules. I mean, you also work in the change space, I know here. Look, what are your thoughts on how governance applies in the context that we're seeing, particularly in our industry?
So when we look at our specific space and this idea of governance, I think by field, governance has been applied differently, but specifically in this risk-averse regulated place, governance has been a discipline that's fundamentally backward-looking. It's based on codified of what worked before or established controls based on the known risks. And it creates those accountability structures that are predictable or based on predictable outcomes. And it's interesting because AI doesn't necessarily lend itself toward that if we want to start maximizing for potential. So agentic AI is going to run into these things where we've got runtime decision, chain actions across systems. So there's no precedent for governing some of these things. And then also, how does that work with our human systems and what we need to do structurally? And this is where I think we should lean into a conversation about the human side of this problem, right? And the idea of adoption no longer being enough for us to understand it. And what does governance look like when we allow more autonomy to these decision-making entities in our processes?
And I guess one of the things that strikes me is there's this huge gap between the really high level of abstraction that most people experience when they engage with AI through, some sort of prompt interface, right? What sort of issues does that create for leaders in there where at one level their own experience is very highly abstracted, but do they really have now got a responsibility where they're actually going to need to understand at a more technical level what's going on within those technologies than they might have in the past? The question is like, how much of this can you delegate on trust, or how much of this requires you as a leader to actually be able to think through much more of the sophistication that's sitting behind that prompt?
Notably, I've seen the conversations with leaders become much more technical at a faster rate than previously before, right? It's a much more show, don't tell market that we have right now. The thing that I've done, the approach that I find to resonate is this idea of phased deployments of automation. And it's not to fall into the 1 to 10, how automated are you, but to help move not only the organization at the pace that's right for the organization, but the technology and the leaders through that too. So phase 1 could really look like we've got a lot more humans in the loop, right? We've got them making these decision points and we're going through it. And then we can set our phase 2, phase 3, phase 4. I actually am seeing with increased speed that we can skip some phases, that the technology literacy has gone up and previous phased models aren't, maybe need some updating because the technology teaches the organization and it goes a lot faster as the friction's been reduced by the tools we have now. So we make sure that we are changing with the policies that are also changing around us. And sometimes that's us leading and having conversations with larger people in policy and with the governments that are making them. And other times it's us saying, if the policy is to change, this is what it could look like. Until then, we're going to be here. So there are other systems that come into your ecosystem that are not just the third party that make more complexity. But it is asking for our leaders to get closer to technology. It
really does bring you back to, is there anything that you can kind of start picking out as enduring truths that people need to kind of get their heads around that will help guide them through a very unstable context?
There is an enduring truth that I occasionally have a rant about, which I don't know if it's a guidance bit, but I'm going to have a rant about it anyway. And that is, I'm in the UK. So in the UK, we'll have a lot of conversation at the enterprise level about, well, we must use US-based models because we trust them, and we must not use Chinese models because we don't trust them. And that to me is just a ludicrous conversation to have, because the UK does not have AI sovereignty. It doesn't really have data center sovereignty. It doesn't have a large volume of compute. So to what degree is the UK or even the EU really competing in this AI race? Well, there are 3, 4, 5, a handful of models that have been developed in the EU. So if you're building or buying, it kind of doesn't matter. You're going to be using either US-centric or Chinese-centric technologies. And at that point, you have to then make a choice. Do I trust this particular enterprise, which is a tech hyperscaler, whatever it is, to host their servers and all of their tech in this particular area where their government, a different country's government, can have access to everything that we do in our organization? And having that conversation, because an enterprise will say, we trust the US, we don't trust China. Either way, you're trusting a foreign government with your data sovereignty. And that's something that most companies don't necessarily get their heads around, because the infrastructure is, to some degree, a monolith. You only have these choices. And if you only have those choices, then to some degree, you don't really have you don't really have any competition in the game. So this whole thing is underpins data governance, and yet to me it's very poorly understood in nearly every conversation that I have with a company that's looking at this stuff. Diana, what do you think?
No, I want to lean into the trust angle, actually, because I think that's a bit more of the macro level of what you're talking about. We can talk about trust in the data sovereignty. We can talk about trust in the way that the system needs to be producing what we needed to when we give away these things. But there are some base and fundamental things that need to be present in order for us to trust. And one of those is that we are able to feel that the system is going to give whatever system, if it's the data center, if it's the agent, if it's the co-pilot on our desktop, when we trust another entity, we are saying that you will be reliably returning what I expect. I will understand why you did that. And if I don't like it, I have some say in that. Right. And that is how we begin to build that as that pattern repeats. What you're seeing is the fragmentation of that pattern on a global scale, right? And then we see it broken down all the way with just how our workers engage with AI. They don't necessarily trust that the output is reliable, or they don't trust that the system implementing it isn't a risk to them. And then we see organizations have the same battles when they give up the decision-making rights of these two agentic systems. They don't necessarily trust that what's happening in what they could reasonably argue is a bit of a predictive black box. They don't always trust that. So that's why we see momentum toward harnessing our agents and right-sizing the workflows and putting in these points of, you can call it abstraction, Tom, but it's actually a little bit of points of control that we can rely on, and then we'll go up the stack in abstraction, and then we'll go up the stack in abstraction. So there's work to be done along the road to getting to the place of that future AI state. But there are a million questions we have to answer on that macro, meso, and micro level.
This is a great conversation because we are able to traverse these different levels, micro and macro, individual, organizational, societal, and we're able to think about that kind of thing. And trust is something that goes across each of these levels, as well as the interactions between those levels. So an individual can trust their organization or cannot trust their organization. An organization could be trusted by society or not, etc. So we have all of these things that are basically an interplay. We're going to shift between these different levels because some of these issues do shift between levels. There are societal implications for everything that we're talking about, for example, and there are individual actions that can lead to organizational value, that can lead to societal benefits or otherwise. But in an organization, if we're having this conversation in a client kind of conversation, then we won't be necessarily talking about these big macro societal things because an organization can't control those things. So the conversation needs to be about how you generate value, how you orchestrate, how you use the tech that's there, not about these huge societal issues. So this is why this multi-layered kind of approach that Diana's talking about is so important, because the enduring truth is too many people in organizations are too bothered about things they cannot control, and they need to focus their efforts and their governance on the things that they can control.
You mentioned my absolute hyperfixation right now, which is the value realization of this, right? And governance has a role to play in the value realization of this. I find increasingly that the value isn't realized by people saying, I have purchased 20,000 licenses and we now have AI value, right? There's a gap between the tools, the way we expect the return to manifest, and it is a point that we need to answer for, especially looking to 2026. My fear is that we will say workflow automation is the key to us solving for value realization. And in some instances, that may prove to be true. But I think the larger transformation we're looking for is still to be found. Thoughts?
Workflow automation is, orchestration is the thing for now, because we still have the capability to look at processes in a granular way, sort of task by task, output by output, node by node, depending on whatever platform you're using. But we're moving quickly into an agentic space where we don't have that granularity. We just go, here's an activity, go and do it, which is also fine. And you potentially get a change in output. When we look at value, usually we look at 2 or 3 things, but you want to make more money and you want to lose less money, basically. I'm going to be very, very simple about that. Losing less money is the governance piece. Making more money is the value chain orchestration piece. Both need to happen, because if I say, right, I'm going to make $1 million in the next year, but I'm going to lose 2 million doing it, it's pointless for me to go and do it. So this is the value balance that we need to make. If you want to rationalize your budgets, at some point you're going to have to look at restructuring your business. And that takes us down this road of synthetic workforces, hybrid workforces, changing the nature of the human versus the machine, how they interact with each other. And all of that is fantastic opportunity. And I use the term fantastic like it is a fantasy. It's a thing that everybody wants. It's a thing that I do in my business, but I do it in a way that suits my business. It doesn't necessarily suit everybody's business to do it the way I do it. So all of these things need to come into play together when we have the governance and the value conversation. Are we going to get value out of this stuff? Well, it kind of depends on if we're able to balance these different things that I'm talking about in a way that does generate value.
So I guess something that struck me a couple of minutes ago as you guys were talking was, and you said about you can't really get distracted into all of the whole of the world aspects of this, right? But the other thing that's also true is that all of the rules and all the norms and all of the customs we have about how we work with each other also do sit in a societal context, right? So there's a whole bunch of stuff that we don't have to codify or talk about specifically in our organization because it's how the rest of the society works, right? I'm trying to get that balance between, well, you can't boil the ocean, worry about everything, but equally you do maybe have to think about things that maybe previously custom, practice, legal standards, norms of your industry took care of, and you just did the version that was specific to your organization. Whereas now, actually, you can't really rely on those. You got to rewire your whole business, or you got to think about your business model in a much more fundamental way. And there are implications for people and knowledge and change, and how up for it you are about a radical transformation of your people that are bigger questions than you might have had to deal with previously. And I'm trying to get to what's the guidance you can give leaders when you're in that situation.
Yeah, well, we started this conversation with how do you feel about everything happening in tech? And Dr. Ash said excited, I said excited and exhausted, right? And so, and the reason behind, I think even our answers to that question is that if you are a leader in this space, even just talking about the space, not running a business, you are aware that all of these other things are shaking up. So if you are watching the pace of it, I think your acceptance rate of the change really matters quite a bit, actually. Because if you are someone in the position to be thinking about the industry of legal and you're seeing the technology changes happening, you didn't wake up that morning and go, what has happened? Oh my gosh. You woke up this morning and went, yes, I understand how we got here. So it is the onus on you to understand how your landscape is changing, but your autonomy to affect it isn't necessarily as there as you need to have a plan. You need to start planning for if we are actually getting to this full automation, what am I the most vulnerable for in automation? There was this article that recently came out for the industry of consulting that had 7 different risks for consulting. You should take that article, create a matrix to profile your risks in that, and look at how exposed you are and at what timetable to it. You should think about how this technology roadmap of if we are getting to this fantastical state, where you need to be as we move along in that. And that would give you a little bit more sense of direction than, wow, the whole world has fallen apart and I don't know where to start, Tom.
Top performers are going to take the revolution by the reins, and they're going to make the most of everything that's in front of them. And then everything that we've said around go and upskill yourself in these areas, go and be fully aware of what the capabilities are, and really think about what the future of your organization needs to be, the future of society, what the workforce architecture needs to look like, what kind of things you're going to do to maximize value. Have a think about those things in the context of your ability to be a top performer. I think too many people just gloss over that first piece and just go, I'm amazing at everything. I'm just going to go and do it. It needs to be reality, right?
I recommend similar. I call it an out-of-work experience, right? Where you need to remove yourself and have that, what am I doing in my job or my profession? What should be automated, right? And what could be automated? So what are the things that are your blockers, your barriers, your time sucks, your energy drains? And then you can get to a higher performance level. There is a marker, though, right now, maybe because of the tools, maybe because of our own operating systems. There is ways that you process information as an individual that you need to maintain that make you good at your job. If you need to go read a book every 3 months, go do that. I'm a long form writer and I think through writing things. So Tom will receive pages and pages of thoughts from me, and I'll call that short. But if I don't do that, then we show up to the meeting and I'm not connected to the information because it's just how I process the information. So you have to be to that level of awareness to know your learning system and how you can augment it and then create more with the tools available to you. And that's on the individual level, but you do the same thing at the organizational level.
Because we are the progress report, there is a question around what represents progress, both for you personally and for the world. I'm going to ask Diana, for you, maybe if you could start.
For me, we can pick up where like you said, we segued to it. I have a strong theory of what a North Star looks like for AI, and you can call it a fantasy, Dr. Ash, but it is this idea of collaborative intelligence, right? Where the system has boundaries and controls. We can call this governance, however we want to look at it, right? There's boundary setting that occurs, and there's coevolution, where I'm becoming better and the system is learning from that, and the system is becoming better. It happens in pockets, but we haven't found a way to really productize or scale that or make that a repeatable pattern, and that's really what would unlock the future of a lot of next tech evolution. And the other is complementarity, which is what we just talked about, which is where are my skills? Where's the system skills? How do we maximize for that now? And how do we make sure we're not overdoing it? Yes, a system can go run and be productive and have 15 agents doing the work of 50 people, and one person has to review it. That's not necessarily to their skill set because that's information overload. They can't do it. You've got to right size it and then scale up. So that is my North Star of where we're going. What does it look like personally for me is we have an opportunity to do a balancing of the scales and how these systems will be built and serve us, right? We can do it for pure efficiency, or we can do it for flourishing. And I don't think we should do it for just one or the other. We have to find a happy medium. But when we are setting our strategy and intention, we should be trying to weight flourishing. Because if you can imagine it's a stone and a feather, right? Like everyone wants efficiency. The flourishing is a harder thing to grasp, but I think that they are related. We need to balance them. So that's my North Star.
Dr. Ash?
So I think my North Star and your public North Star, not your personal one, but what you think for society. I think they're very aligned because I'm running a almost fully agentic business. I've got a couple of people, but agents do so much of the heavy lifting. And we do have human review, but it's not insurmountable to actually review everything. I'm building all the systems, so I do know what's happening in each of the different systems. The North Star for me, that personal business-oriented North Star, is that should be scalable. And I've written a piece on puppet master competencies, right? So what do we need a human being in the workforce to do in the future when they're managing a bunch of agents like a puppet master? Because it's partly review, it's partly understanding what the guardrails are, it's partly monitoring. All of these things that we've discussed over the last hour need to be a part of that core competency. The North Star for society needs to be the people who are able to create value in this kind of puppet master way. They're running the value chain of society in a way that everybody else can live off without necessarily having to be sitting around in organizations being paid for doing nothing. So there needs to be this value split. Now, I'm not sure that will happen anytime soon because of vested interests and social issues and all of the other things that we call politics, right? But I think that, to me, would be a valuable North Star for society.
One of our challenges is to try and help people think about things differently. And I think you've both done a wonderful job of giving, certainly me, lots to think about. Diana, Ashwin, thank you so much for taking the time to join us here on the Progress Report.
Thank you for having me.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not at all surprised of the energy of the discussion that we've just had with our two guests, and it gives a lot to think about for leaders in their organizations as they contemplate, what sort of governance structures they need to put in place. And clearly there is a necessity for people to think about their organizations in perhaps a more deeply specific way than they've been used to. I hope you found the conversation as interesting, certainly as I have. And if you did, please do like, share and subscribe the Progress Report.